Us about his latest articles he wrote about Biden and his Zionism. How are you doing, Branko?
Hey, good. How are you?
Pretty good. I know you have bylines in Jacobin, and this latest article is in these times. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's great. It was a co-published piece. Yeah.
Yeah. So for me, what's very interesting is that Biden is a very strong ideological Zionist.
Were I a Jew, I would be a Zionist. And my father pointed out to me, I did not need to be a Jew to be a Zionist, for I am. Israel is essential to the security of Jews worldwide.
And he has gone further than both Ronald Reagan and Herbert Walker, and also George W. Bush in his support for Israel. And so you wrote a piece about the origins of it. Can you talk a little bit about it?
Yeah, I think a lot of people have asked the question of where does Biden's commitment to Israel comes from, because it seems so self-destructive, not just for his political career and his re-election chances in 2024, but also if you think about just kind of naked U.S. interests. A lot of the U.S. government, many people under Biden have objected to this policy, not even necessarily because of the moral aspect of it, but just because it is so destructive towards the United States reputationally, towards its standing, towards kind of the moral authority it tries to maintain around the world. And so the question is why is he, or why has he persisted with this support for this obviously very damaging war? And I was skeptical of the idea that he is purely someone who just has this very intense emotional commitment to Israel, which is usually how it is explained. And it's certainly how Biden himself explains it, that his father instilled kind of a love, or at least a devotion to Israel in him as a boy because of what happened in the horrors of World War II. But I had written about Biden's life before, and I remember that there was a episode from the very beginning of his career in 1972 when he ran for Senate, where a campaign volunteer quit because this volunteer said Biden had asked him to write a position paper in the Middle East, and had told him basically, I can't put my personal views on here because those views would be political suicide. And I have to basically put down something else that'll be more politically palatable. And whatever stance I take on the conflict now in 1972 will be the one that I stick with for the rest of my career. So basically, I just went to Wilmington and some other places to find what records I could of any of Biden's correspondence with local, pro-Israel advocacy groups. And, what I found, I would say confirms that this was ultimately a position that he adopted out of political ambition rather than any sort of genuine commitment. And I think, even now, even as the policy seems quite counterproductive to his own political interests, I think that explanation still holds today.
So was he being paid by some Israeli group in his Senate campaign, or was it just the constituency in Delaware?
Money is not really the way to think about this. I mean, there's a variety of interest groups that operate in U.S. politics that put pressure on politicians and candidates and so on and so forth. I mean, Biden himself allegedly said that part of it was they were looking for donors, Jewish donors, and they thought that maybe if he put his real views about Israel, that he would be alienated by this. But it's not. Money is only really part of the picture. I think Biden is someone who throughout his career is someone who has chosen often the path of least resistance. He's someone who's ascent up the kind of hierarchical ladder is the main priority in his career. And he has often chosen, very, easy solutions. He's chosen political pathways that are going to ruffle the least amount of feathers, and often, he to the point where he will nakedly say different things to different groups in different speeches, if it means that he's going to be able to curry favor with those groups. So I think in this case, it's more about, not wanting to alienate what he perceived as a very important constituency in the state that would help him win. And I think beyond that, on a national level, I think that applies too. But certainly by the time you get into the 80s, and Biden starts to really explore running for president and becoming a national figure, the financial side of things does become more prominent, because at that point, for instance, his 1987 campaign is very closely intertwined with AIPAC, which AIPAC was not really that much of an issue in his 72 campaign and some of the stuff that happened in the 70s. But by the 80s, it's much more of a force, and his campaign financing operation becomes intertwined with it. And I think from there on, Biden ended up being one of the top recipients of pro-Israel lobby money. So it's complicated. I wouldn't say money is kind of the main part of the story, but of course, it's American politics. So of course, it's going to play some kind of role.
Well, for me, one story that's really shocking to me is that there was a phone call between Meacham and Ronald Reagan where Israel was just slaughtering people like in the Shatia and Sabra camps. And then Ronald Reagan wanted to pull back, but Biden was like okay with killing women and children. Do you remember that?
Yeah, I mean, well, that was actually something that was it was written about in an Israeli newspaper years ago by that very, at the time, considered very hard right-wing prime minister Reagan, and he recalled that when Israel had invaded Lebanon, and at the time there were images coming back into American TV screens and newspapers that were very similar to the ones that we're seeing now out of Gaza, very upsetting, very horrific and brutal, and there was a lot of public outrage about it, and not just in the United States, globally, even in Israel. According to Biden ended up in this meeting with him kind of suggesting that if Canada had attacked the United States, which, I mean, that's not really how the war in Lebanon started, but whatever, this was Biden's kind of retelling of the facts. If Canada attacked the United States, then, the United States would kill every man, woman, and child in Canada, and they'd be completely justified to do it, and that would be the right thing to do. Whether or not Biden really in his heart believes this, it's hard to say, but it shows something. Biden, in his attempt to always curry favor with other, pro-Israel advocacy groups or with the Israeli government itself, and to kind of prove himself their best friend, he would take positions that were completely, almost absurdly beyond the pale. Positions that even the Israeli government at the time, disavowed. I mean, Reagan, for instance, when he recounted that story, he said he found Biden's speech quite offensive. And we see that in some of the things that I reported, based on the archives. We see that in those documents where Biden, in speaking to local advocacy groups and speaking to Golda Meir, at the time the prime minister of Israel, basically suggests that Israel should hang on to the Gaza Strip and the West Bank and other territory that it had seized in the 1967 war, which is not the position of almost anyone in the U.S. political sphere, certainly the Democratic Party. The idea was always that land was going to be given back and it was going to be part of a Palestinian state. But it shows you that Biden kind of, often the recent convert is the most overzealous because they do not have a very firm grasp of the history of the issues. It's more about just kind of pandering to the opinion of the other person that they want to get the support of.
Yeah, and to me, it shows this because you also mentioned this in your article. Rafah was supposed to be a red line, and then that was crossed, and so now it shows that there are no red lines.
Yeah, I mean that's been the story of this entire war. The United States kind of lays down some kind of line, or it says, you know what, we've been okay with this until now, but this is the point where it has to stop, and you can't do this. And Netanyahu and his government just kind of nod along and say, okay, sure, and then they just go ahead and violate it anyway. And of course, the response from the Biden administration is to do absolutely nothing and to just basically meekly fall into line. So, I mean, as one example, you gave the Rafah example where Biden laid down the red line. He also said he suspended some transfers of large bombs to Israel. Very soon after that, he gets an email, or his advisors get an email from a major Democratic donor, Haim Saban, saying, this is a very bad idea. You need to reconsider. Remember, there's a lot more voters who sympathize with Israel than sympathize with Palestine. And shortly after, Biden ends up unsuspending some of those bomb transfers, and of course allows his red line to be crossed, and makes the United States look very weak and impotent on the world stage. Another example, I mean, it was back in December, Tony Blinken was telling Netanyahu, hey, we let you do this for a couple of months, but this really has to end in a couple of weeks, or at least there has to, the way that you're fighting this war has to change, because this cannot go on. And of course now, I mean, that was in December. We are now 7 months from there, so unfortunately, the Biden administration's willingness to just kind of lie down and be a doormat for the Netanyahu government, that's been a pattern throughout this entire bloody conflict.
So, in your article, you mentioned something about the actually, there's a lot of interesting things with the Biden family and the DuPont family. But you mentioned something about a conversation between Irving Shapiro, who was the CEO of DuPont at that time, and Biden in the 1970s. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, DuPont, it's a massive chemical company. They're actually responsible for those forever chemicals that we've heard so much about, the ones that, it turns out that once they're in your body, they never, ever leave, and now are kind of like in the bloodstream of every human being that lives in the United States, including you and me and everyone listening to this probably. And DuPont was kind of the corporate power in Delaware. I mean, the family was incredibly powerful. That company had ties to every politician. I couldn't go into the piece because there's so much material, but the DuPont was deeply involved in local politics and national politics. They were giving to the Nixon campaign, and they devised legislative strategies for how to push their political priorities over the line. And the guy who was the CEO of DuPont when Biden came into the Senate was a guy called Irving Shapiro, who was a very pro-Israel guy. He was very involved in a lot of these groups that were trying to pressure Biden to take a more kind of forceful pro-Israel line. Biden has been open about that. He spoke in 1975. He said Irving Shapiro is a good friend of mine. There's an example, again, not in the piece, but when Shapiro became the CEO of DuPont, Business Week, this periodical, they did a profile of him, a very glowing profile, and Biden put that profile into the congressional record and sort of paid tribute to Irving Shapiro. And he spoke about how, he sought out Shapiro's opinion on things, and how he went out of his way to speak to DuPont, to get DuPont's thinking about different events and so on and so forth. I think that was another person in the constellation of pro-Israel advocacy in Delaware and nationally. Shapiro, I think, was a key figure in sort of helping link Biden up with different figures, and I think also kind of helping to push him to be more friendly to Israel.
And Biden was the head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, right?
At one point he was, yeah. I cannot remember exactly when he became chairman of it, but yes, yeah.
Yeah, and well, at least during his Senate, he was one of the big pushers for the Iraq War. And as we now know, Benjamin Netanyahu was also one of the lobbyists on behalf of the Iraq War. Do you think his opinion on his ideology on Israel influenced his opinion on the Iraq War, or was it separate?
Yeah, well, actually, and then that was when he was chairman. So yeah, that he had a huge influence on pushing the Iraq War. Probably the most important Democrat in terms of making that disaster happen. Was it because of Israel? I mean, it's possible. Perhaps one day when the University of Delaware finally allows us to look at Biden's senatorial papers, which will be years and years from now, because he's locked them away until he's, I think, like 5 years after he stops being a public figure. Maybe we'll find out. I think from what I have gleaned from my research, it seems like a much simpler explanation, and I think explains again a lot of the stuff that he's doing now and why he has taken such a kind of over the top pro-Israel position over the course of his career, which was that in 2002, Biden was up for re-election. The guy he was running against was the only challenger he had up to that point who was able to raise money like he had. And he made very clear, he said very explicitly, I'm going to attack Biden for not being supportive enough of George W. Bush in the war on terrorism. I'm going to attack him for being soft on terror. And, it's not a coincidence, I think, that then what you see is the big project Biden takes in 2002 is kind of becoming the friendliest Democrat to Bush on foreign policy, and ultimately helping push the Iraq War as chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He played a very large role in spreading the idea that Saddam had links to Al-Qaeda. He had these famous hearings about the Iraq War. We basically stacked the hearings with voices that were all for war, all for these claims that there were WMDs, that there were links to Al-Qaeda, but with Saddam and so on and so forth, and helping to kind of misinform the public and create support for the war. And then, by the way, later that year, I think in October 2002, Biden is speaking to a bunch of a group of African-American newspaper columnists, and he says, "Oh, you know what? I don't think we want to go to war. It's a bad idea. I don't think Saddam has any ties to Al-Qaeda. This is all red herring. This would be a very bad idea." And then, of course, months later, he ends up going back to verbally supporting it. So that shows you, how, number one, I think Biden, kind of some of the cowardly stances he's taken and how that's led to some of his political positions, but also how much of a shapeshifter he can be, depending on what audience he's speaking to.
Well, yeah, I mean, he can be a shapeshifter when he's speaking to an audience, but it seems like his record is very consistent in that he tends to be very pro-war, very hawkish, and he follows the neocon position in almost all foreign policy doctrines.
Yeah, I mean, you could go back to the 80s. It's when Reagan won, and basically Biden took that as a signal that the political winds had shifted, irreparably, and the Democratic Party basically needed to be more like Reagan. And so he actually said to people, not only did he say that he did this tour where he spoke to Democrats around the country, and not only did he make the case that Democrats needed to adopt a more similar kind of economic position as Reagan, but he was also saying we need to be more willing to use force than we have been. We need to be more willing to use the instruments of the military. And remember, this was a guy who had been elected in 1972 on opposition to the Vietnam War. And actually,
really?
Biden ran in 1972 as an anti-war candidate. I mean, people at the time said that they don't remember him having a very particularly anti-war position in his personal life. In fact, somebody actually said that they remembered him supporting the war. But politically, the safest thing to do was to run against Vietnam, and especially as a Democrat. And so that's what he did. And actually, he ended up voting against a number of military aid bills to Vietnam and Cambodia. Coincidentally, also at the same time, voting down military aid to Israel at the same time. So, but that was the shift he made, and so, I mean, a lot of it is driven by politics. I mean, almost every decision that Biden has made has been about his own personal ambition, to be quite frank with you. So, there's also reports that under Obama, he was a little less hawkish, that he didn't want, for instance, Obama to go and assassinate Osama bin Laden. They thought that was a bad idea, that he was urging against the kind of doubling down in Afghanistan. And we did see Biden eventually, as president, withdraw from Afghanistan, which I think he does deserve credit for. There's a lot of, not a lot he deserves credit for, but.
Is it because the Afghan army collapsed because of all the mismanagement?
Well, I think, there's a variety of possible explanations. Number one, I mean, that deal was negotiated by Trump in the first place, so Biden kind of inherited it. He just had to follow through on it. Number two, I mean, I think it's possible that he did not expect the really vicious response from the press towards the withdrawal, because, that staying in Afghanistan was not a popular position. Presidents have been trying to get out of there for years, for decades, actually. And so even I was shocked, because until that time in August 2021, Biden had gone pretty much a free ride from the media. He was very treated very, very softly. And they really went after him for that decision. And he ended up sticking to it, which I was surprised about at the time, because again, as I've said before, political courage has not really been one of the prominent features of Biden's career. Why it is that he stuck with it, it seems like he thinks that was the right thing to do. It may also be, we've seen him so stubbornly sticking to the war in Gaza, despite everything. We saw him sticking to his own presidential run, seemingly doubling down the more that kind of he was attacked by the media and by other Democrats as being unfit to run. So it could be some of that stubbornness also played a role in his decision to end up sticking in Afghanistan. I don't know. But yeah, he has tended to change his opinion on this stuff based on where the political winds are blowing in history.
But it's clear, like, every political wind is anti-Israel, but that's not changing his position.
Well, the question I would ask is he aware of that? I mean, there has been so much reporting about the fact that, since that debate performance that ended up costing him his career, was that his aides apparently not feeding him the full picture of information, that they don't add bad news into the daily briefings that he gets, that when he finally stepped down, reportedly, as we're speaking this past Sunday, according to reports about how the meeting went, his campaign had not done polling in battleground states for 2 months, and they finally showed him this new polling that showed that he could not win. He spoke in the press conference and in interviews. He said, based on polls I've seen, I'm doing well. And people have questioned, wait, hold on, what information is he getting? Is he just saying that, or does he really believe that? Because he hasn't been shown the full picture. There was a Politico report from back in February, I think, shortly after the Michigan uncommitted vote, and it talked about how Biden was surprised at the level of anger against him by Muslim and Arab American voters over the Gaza war. And this report mentioned offhandedly that his aides had been, quote, keeping him in a bubble about that issue. So, this is speculation because we really don't know what has. I think it's become very clear over the last 3-4 weeks that we have no idea about what's been going on in this White House and how it operates for the past 4 years. But I do wonder, is he aware of the political reality and how it's changed from the time that he was a young man running for Senate in 1972?
it's hard for me to say. So yesterday, it seems like my theory is that Netanyahu is secretly like campaigning for Trump, but he said he was disappointed by his conversation with Vice President Harris. So do you think she'll be softer, or is it just platitudes?
I don't know. I hope that it means something, because this horrendous mass murder has to end, for everyone's sake. So I would hope that it actually means something, that all these kind of signals that we're getting from the Harris camp are signs of an actual shift. But I mean, I think if it's just going to be these small rhetorical gestures, if it's not going to be something more forceful, something like what Hubert Humphrey did in 1968 when he came out against his own president's policy on Vietnam, I think it's not enough. And there's a long time before not just the presidential election, but also Harris's inauguration. So I mean, that's she'll be inaugurated if she won in 6 months, maybe more. I mean, already we are hearing that famine has taken hold everywhere in Gaza. That there's polio in the water. So the amount of death that could happen between now and then, if something does not change, is pretty staggering to think about. I think what, for people who are activists, anyone who's listening to this who wants to try and affect policy, I think they need to use this moment. Harris clearly wants to and understands the more than Biden, the political peril of taking this position of backing this war unequivocally. So I think they need to use that to try and pressure her and try and pressure maybe even Biden to change course now. But it's any change is not going to happen without people getting active and doing what they can to put pressure on them.
That makes sense. I know you have to go soon. So where can people find you, and what are you up to next?
Yeah, they can find me on Twitter at Marcetic, Marchetich. They can find me at Jacobin. That's where I'm a staff writer. Jacobin is a socialist publication that covers everything from domestic to foreign policy and culture and all sorts of things. So very important these days to support publications that you believe in. I write for In These Times occasionally, another great publication, Chicago-based. Usually I'll be, if you go to one or more of those places, you will be able to keep up with what I'm doing. At the moment, I'm having a bit of a break after a pretty intense few weeks, but I'm sure there'll be more stories from me coming soon.
That makes sense. Thank you very much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.